able to paint like Picasso, Matisse, or Modigliani. Now, imagine using that talent to deceive the world for decades. In the world of art, the line between genius and deception is often razor thin. Today, we're talking about an enigma, Elmyr de Hory, an artist whose talent and trickery fooled the art world. He is arguably the most notorious art forger in history. My name is Jaime Lee, and welcome back to my channel. I'm a mixed media artist with a love for weird art history stories. If that sounds interesting to you, go ahead and subscribe and ring the bell if you haven't already. According to Wikipedia, quote, "Art forgery is the creation and sale of works of art which are falsely credited to other, usually more famous artists," unquote. It involves misrepresenting an already existing piece or creating something in the style of a certain artist and claiming they did it, unquote. Wikipedia also states, quote, "Art forgery can result in serious charges if the art is sold for large amounts of money," unquote. But like anything in life, especially illegal things, this may not always be true. Art forgery goes back thousands of years. Roman sculptors passed off copies of Greek sculptures, and the buyers likely knew they were fake. During the Renaissance, forgeries were a lucrative and open business. Famous artists often took on apprentices who would create work in their master styles, and then the pieces would be sold and attributed to the master. Some of the world's most famous artists made forgeries, like, Michelangelo, who created and sold an ancient sleeping Cupid to Lorenzo de' Medici, ruler of Florence back in the 1400s, who found out it was fake and wanted his money back, but Michelangelo got to keep his part of the money. In Imperial China, forgeries and originals enjoyed the same level of prestige. Forgeries have been discovered across the globe, from Australia to Africa and everywhere in between. They were created for various reasons, ranging from making money from tourist trinkets to defrauding auction houses, art galleries, and prestigious art buyers. Sometimes forgeries pass through the hands of auction houses, even authenticators, without being discovered. Sometimes, allegedly, fake art was authenticated as real if enough grease was given to the wheel. Wink, wink. And other times, people who bought art that turned out to be fake tried to hold the seller responsible and found that they, including famous auction houses, washed their hands of the situation and claimed no knowledge or responsibility. You see why I said that even though art forging is highly illegal, sometimes it's not? And that leads us to the subject of this video. A master of art forgery who fooled the elite art world for decades and whose talent as an art forger arguably rivaled that of, and sometimes even surpassed, the famous artists he was imitating. I'm talking about Elmyr de Hory, aka Elmyr de Hory, Elmer Herzog, Elmer Cassou, Elmer Hoffman, Louis Cassou, Joseph Dory Boutin, Elmyr Dory Boutin, Elmyr Horthy. You get the idea. For the purposes of this video, I will be referring to him as Elmyr de Hory, as that is the name he is most well known by. Elmyr de Hory was born in Hungary in 1906. Though his early life remains somewhat mysterious, mainly because he seemed to have lied about a lot of it, it is known that he showed artistic talent from a young age. His birth records were found in Budapest, dated 1906, for Elmer Albert Hoffman, son of Adolf and Irene. Elmyr told people his father was a Roman Catholic diplomat, or an Austro-Hungarian diplomat. But the records listed his father, Adolf, as a Jewish merchant, a wholesaler of handcrafted goods. In a later biography, which I will talk about a little more later in this video, he discussed his parents' divorce when he was 16, which also didn't happen. He claimed Nazis killed his whole family, but he once had a cousin visit his Ibiza villa later in life, and it came out that this cousin, Istvan Hont, was actually his brother. His mother and his brother are actually listed as survivors of the Holocaust. All this to show that Elmyr wasn't exactly the most reliable narrator. His artistic talent did benefit him, though. He started his schooling at a Romanian artist colony when he was 16, then moved to the Academy Heinemann art school in Munich, Germany, to study classical painting at 18. In 1926, he was in Paris at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière, where he studied figurative art under Fernand Léger. He was done with his formal schooling in 1928, but here he ran into a problem. After art school, Elmyr struggled to find success. The post-war/Great Depression economy was tough, and his own style didn't get much attention. The world had moved on to Cubism, Expressionism, Fauvism, leaving him in the dust, so to speak. His life took a little detour when he discovered that he would not be able to make a living from his art. And I mean criminal detour. He was arrested for minor crimes around Europe, such as counterfeiting documents or claiming to be aristocracy, which he wasn't, of course. Then Elmyr somehow became entangled with a British journalist who was suspected to be a spy at the beginning of World War II. This, and what in the Dracula is going on here, I don't know, landed Elmyr in a Transylvanian prison for political dissidents in the Carpathian Mountains. Yeah, that really happened. He was released, only then to land himself in a German concentration camp because Nazis suspected that he was a gay Jewish man. Technically, they weren't wrong. He was luckily sent to a Berlin prison hospital, but escaped and turned once again to Paris and art. De Hory's fortunes changed when he again discovered that his own art wasn't getting him anywhere, but art by other artists was. Yup, he began to forge works by famous artists. It started innocently, kind of. He sold a drawing to a British woman who mistook it for a Picasso. And let's just say Elmyr didn't rush to correct her. He started to sell Picassos to art galleries in Paris, and since he had been honing his skills as a liar his whole life, came up with some apparently believable explanations as to how he had gotten these Picassos. Think the last of his aristocratic family's heirloom art collection after the war, or that Picasso himself had given them to him when they knew each other in Paris. His skill was remarkable. So remarkable that his forgeries fooled art experts, galleries, and collectors worldwide over the time period from the 1950s through his death in 1976. How did he make these fakes so authentic? It started with a talent for imitation. He was able to easily mimic the styles of many different artists, like Matisse and Rodin, as mentioned before, and also Raoul Dufay, André Derain, Kees van Dongen. In fact, his skill was so great, he fooled art experts and sometimes even the artists themselves. An expert on paintings by Raoul Dufay started to believe that Elmyr's fakes were the real deal and authentic Dufay's were not authentic. And Kees van Dongen, as an old man, took Elmyr's fakes of his paintings as his own artworks, recalling a particular model who was the subject of one of the paintings and how he and the model spent some time between the sheets. And mind you, this was a painting that he had never actually painted. Elmyr started traveling a little and selling the fakes that he created, realizing that he could make a living off them way better than he could his own art. He landed in America in 1957, where he expanded his business over the next decade, plus expanding his style to include Matisse, Modigliani, Renoir. Unfortunately, not everybody was stupid, and some galleries began to get suspicious. This is when Elmyr started to come up with at least a dozen pseudonyms that he used to do mail order selling. Then, as they say, what goes up must come down. Elmyr had his first close call in Boston in the 1950s. When a curator at the Fogg Museum at Harvard became suspicious of his drawings. He first sold a Matisse, then a Modigliani, and Renoir in short succession. The curator was squinting at Elmyr because the style of all three was, pretty similar. She then began ratting out Elmyr under the pseudonym he'd used for her to other galleries and people in the art world. It was here that Elmyr entered a downward spiral. He tried selling his own paintings again and ended up in a low-end apartment in Los Angeles, painting pink poodles for interior decorators. He sold forgeries in Chicago and had federal charges pressed against him, and soon the FBI was taking notice. But that was nothing compared to what he got himself tangled into next. He met a man named Fernand Legros. And they entered a business partnership where Elmyr created forgeries and Legros sold them and kept most of the profit for himself. This, of course, wasn't how the arrangement was supposed to be, but Legros, well, he was kind of shady. Fernand was a gay man who already had business and personal dealings with another man, a French-Canadian named Réal Lessard. Legros knew Elmyr created forgeries and saw dollar signs. His proposal was that he and Lessard would sell the paintings that Elmyr created, and they would split the profits evenly. This idea seemed good to Elmyr, who wasn't a good businessman. The problem? Well, number one, Réal and Fernand had a relationship before meeting Elmyr, and once the deal got going, Elmyr and Réal started a relationship. You know how well that always turns out. Number two, since Elmyr washed his hands of the more businessy aspects of the deal, it allowed Legros to fully take advantage of him. I'll let Réal explain that one. Quote, "We had to keep him poor or he'd have quit. He needed incentive. Whenever he had money, he didn't see why he should work. So we decided rather than give him large sums of cash, we'd bring him gifts, like the portable TV set or a red sports car. That sort of thing always made him happy. He was like a child." Unquote. Legros also demanded that Elmyr only sell paintings through him, and started pocketing more than the 50-50 they had agreed to. Legros would give him $2,000 and $5,000 checks for the paintings he and Lessard were selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars. They got Elmyr to keep creating paintings by threatening him and keeping him scared. Legros would tell him that he would get Elmyr imprisoned on homosexuality charges or convicted of fraud if he didn't paint more forgeries. The three men had an incredibly toxic relationship, personally and professionally. Legros was abusive toward Lessard, and the two were jailed on the regular. Elmyr didn't trust Legros, which he should have listened to more closely. Legros trying to control Elmyr only made him mad, so on a planned trip to Paris for the three of them to sell paintings, Elmyr had sold some paintings on his own in secret before they left and used that money to abandon the other two men for a stint of him trying to do things all by himself. This didn't last because Elmyr soon grew tired of traveling. This is when he discovered Ibiza, and he decided he wanted to settle down there. Lessard and Legros eventually caught up to him there in Ibiza, and to Elmyr's surprise, they weren't even really mad at him for abandoning them. The group struck a new deal. Legros would pay Elmyr $400 a month for a place to live on Ibiza if the two men could continue selling Elmyr's forgeries. This worked, but not for long. So his downfall actually started with a client. In 1966, an oil baron from Dallas, Texas, named Alger Meadows, discovered that Legros had sold him at least 60 forgeries. To say he was pissed was an understatement. You see, Meadows thought he was building a collection of masterworks from war-torn European countries that desperate art dealers were practically giving to him. Legros sold him a collection of paintings by famous painters that were really Elmyr forgeries. Ready to bask in the glow of his financial windfall he was going to enjoy from this collection of paintings, Meadows had his collection of masterpieces appraised and discovered that they were fake. The swindler had become the swindled, and Elmyr was at the root of it. This was when Elmyr began gaining notoriety as a master forger of paintings. Meadows wanted Legros arrested, so Legros did what any sane criminal would do. He fled the country. He actually went to Ibiza, kicked Elmyr out of the house that he was staying in, finally got arrested himself when authorities caught up to him and was sent to prison for check fraud. So this left Elmyr on the run. He didn't last long though, and when he returned to Ibiza, he was convicted by a Spanish court to 2 months in prison for, and this is a little weird, consorting with criminals, homosexuality, and not having a way to support himself. Why wasn't he convicted of forgery? Well, the court couldn't prove he'd ever created the forged paintings in Spain or Ibiza. Upon release, he was kicked out of Ibiza for a whole year. And here's where things take a turn again. In his time away from Ibiza, Elmyr became famous. He made a triumphant return to Ibiza after a year, and from the late 1960s into the 70s, he enjoyed the life of a celebrity. Now, he still wasn't really able to sell his own paintings, which must have been so frustrating. But people got wind of his story and were dying to know more. He began to hang out in Ibiza with noted famous people like Marlene Dietrich, Ursula Andress, Marilyn Monroe, Liz Taylor, Montgomery Clift, Rita Hayworth, and Orson Welles. Orson Welles made a documentary in 1974 called F for Fake about Elmyr de Hory, and Clifford Irving wrote a biography called Fake, the story of Elmyr de Hory, the greatest art forger of our time. This biography is where he told Irving of his parents' divorce, fake, his childhood, largely fake, and his family being killed by Nazis. Fake. So I guess Fake was a great title for this book, but it did become an international bestseller. Although everyone involved could be called into question because it was later revealed that Clifford Irving had about as many scruples as Elmyr did, since he was unmasked for having written a fake biography of Howard Hughes. Elmyr's time in Ibiza in the 70s was a great contrast to the rest of his life, spent struggling and often on the run. Here he lived in a villa, La Falaise, where he threw lavish parties full of writers, artists, theater and film stars, intellectuals, and beautiful people. According to the blog at myelmyr.net, written by his friend, housemate, and later on, after Elmyr's death, the keeper of his legacy, Mark Forgy. Elmyr looked and acted the part. He spoke with an intriguing accent, wore a golden monocle, and was well-dressed, dapper. People who visited him suspected he was descended from royalty. By all accounts, he enjoyed his time on the island and was able to stay clear of the authorities, who wanted to pursue charges against him for forgery. But, as Johnny Cash famously sung, "What's down in the dark will be brought to the light. You can run on for a long time. Sooner or later, God'll cut you down." On December 11th, 1976, at age 70, Elmyr de Hory swallowed a handful of sleeping pills mixed with cognac. Why this sudden change? After so many years spent enjoying the fruits of his ill-gotten gains? France had been keen to prosecute Elmyr for a while, but France and Spain, which Ibiza is a part of, hadn't yet worked out an extradition treaty. That day, December 11th, Mark Forgy told Elmyr that Spain had finally agreed to extradite Elmyr to France so he could be prosecuted for forgery. According to Forgy, quote, he did not want to go to France, to prison. That was his greatest fear. And it was only a matter of hours until the Spanish police came to drag him off in chains. He couldn't tolerate the total humiliation, unquote. Add to this that Elmyr was convinced that if he were sent to France, Legros would turn on him. He believed Legros would have Lessard killed. And with no one to back him up, Elmyr would face all the blame for the forgery scheme. He couldn't face this fate, so he took things into his own hands. When Mark discovered Elmyr, he was laying face down on his bed. Forgy had strict instructions from Elmyr that he did not want any intervention to save him. But Mark managed to get a dying Elmyr to the car and with a neighbor's help rushed him to the hospital. But by the time they got there, it was too late. Elmyr had died in his friend Mark's arms. Elmyr Elmyr's talent for forgery was so great that it still affects the art world to this day. He is labeled as the world's most prolific art forger, and it's estimated he created 1,000 forgeries. It's estimated that his forgeries sold for $50 to $60 million. Many of these paintings are still floating around today, undetected. He fooled some of the most esteemed galleries, auction houses, and critics. He was only caught not because his fakes were bad, but because the styles of the fakes were similar enough that people took notice. As a painter, he was a chameleon, a shapeshifter, mastering the painting style of famous painters so much that people who knew, couldn't tell. So how did he do it? As you know, a magician never reveals his tricks. But we do know a little about how Elmyr was able to fool the world's top art experts. It started with creating the artworks. Elmyr made many artworks on paper because the right paper was easy to get. For paintings on canvas, Elmyr would often scour flea markets and snatch up 19th century paintings. Then he would scrape off the paint, and after he created the paintings, he would use commercial varnishes to provide a cracking effect or an aged golden color. Once the paintings were created, more deception helped pull off the scam. Since it was believed back then that if it was in a book, it must be true, Elmyr, Legros, and Lessard had a system in place where they would photograph Elmyr's forgery, make a glossy print of it, take the color plate of art books out, and replace them with the glossy image of Elmyr's version of the painting. Pretty sneaky, eh? Finally, Lessard and Legros were in charge of documenting the fakes correctly, with essentially bribing or paying off the experts, and creating legitimate and believable documents and stamps. Back in the 50s through the 70s, all of these efforts were enough to convince galleries, experts, collectors, museums, and auction houses that they were getting an authentic piece of art. Back then, experts would spend days examining a painting to verify that it was real. And the method Elmyr and his partners used was so flawless, the paintings would often be returned as genuine. However, with 1,000 or more forgeries under his belt, it has become something of a headache to try to weed out the Elmyrs from the originals. There is new technology now, including forensic techniques like X-ray fluorescence and Raman spectrometry. And one thing about Elmyr as a forger that is unique is that he never copied another artist's painting, but instead created a new painting in that artist's style, as if it was done by that artist. But by the time he was at his end of his forging career, his status as an artist himself was so great that some people were thrilled to find out that their painting was actually an Elmyr fake. In fact, many cherished their Elmyr paintings as if they were any other important work. A friend of Elmyr's insisted that he wasn't angry that Elmyr sold him a fake, came clean, wrote 2 checks to cover the amount he sold it for, only to have the 2 checks bounce. The friend stated, quote, "He's a charming crook. I wouldn't be surprised if he really believed on both occasions that there was cash in the bank to cover the checks. No, I still consider him a friend." Unquote. The late actor Kirk Douglas wrote in his autobiography how much he loved his Elmyrs, which were supposed to be a Monet and a Van Gogh. Elmyr said about his work, quote, "I don't like the word fake, but I'll use it. I made paintings in the style of certain artists. I never copied. The only fake thing about my paintings was the signature," unquote. And later on, even that wasn't fake. In fact, in the late 1960s, in Ibiza, when Elmyr began painting forgeries again, he signed them Elmyr. It's a funny thing about fraud. Art fraud is very difficult to prove. Add to this that painting or working in the style of another artist isn't fraud, isn't illegal. In fact, it's encouraged. Imitating other artists' style is a valued technique when learning art. Painting or working in a particular style can teach an artist valuable skills and techniques that they might not otherwise learn. Where Elmyr knowingly crossed the line was selling the art he created as something that it was not, or the true definition of fraud. One of the main problems people had with Elmyr, in particular, was that surprisingly his work was good. Sometimes it was so good, it was better than the artist he was imitating. As Elmyr himself asked, quote, "Would you prefer a bad original to a good fake?" unquote. It brings up a whole new conversation about fraud and the art world. If both paintings are good, why is one automatically considered trash? Because it has the wrong signature. Elmyr did a lot of things right. He was a classically trained artist. He worked hard to create good artworks. He could master many popular styles. The one thing that soured everything was that he had to sell his paintings as if they weren't his. And truth be told, he seemed to enjoy that part of the hoax too, that his paintings had massive value because people couldn't tell the difference between real and fake. You see, Elmyr saw himself as sort of a Robin Hood, just a regular man who used his talent and charisma to pull the wool over the eyes of all those stuffy, stuck-up bigwigs who ruled the art world. That was part of his persona, his mystery. How many fakes are out there? Today, these Elmyr paintings are all over the world, some debunked with new technology, and some still undetected. That's because in the late 1980s and early 90s, long after Elmyr's death, Elmyr paintings began popping up. It got so bad that auction houses and galleries refused paintings signed Elmyr because it was clear that someone, or many someones, were creating fake Elmyrs. Oh, the irony. Which Elmyrs are real and which ones are, well, fake? If you enjoyed this dive into the life of Elmyr de Hory and the world of art forgery, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. I'm so glad that you hung out with me today for this video, and I will see you again in my next video real soon. Bye!